this story on Trump sharing a meme about annexing Canada. It was covered by 191 different sources, 17 of which had a left-leaning bias and 36 of which had a right-leaning one. For example, social media users slam Donald Trump's unhinged Canada maps, says HuffPost, versus over at Fox News, where we got Trump trolls Canada again, shares map with country as part of US. Oh, Canada. I have been using Ground News for many years now, and my favorite feature of theirs is something called Blind Spot, which I have installed as a widget on my iPhone. And throughout the day, the feed refreshes with different stories, one of which is being mostly covered by conservative media, and one of which is being mostly covered by liberal media. Ground News is now deeply integrated into the way that I keep on top of current affairs, and the same can be true of you. If you sign up using ground.news/JJ, or click on the link in the thing below, or use this handy-dandy QR code, you can get an amazing 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. It is an amazing deal at only about $5 a month. So what are you waiting for? Do not delay. Give Ground News a try today. Ground News. See every side of every story. Now, as I said, Prime Minister Trudeau is not resigning in response to some big scandal or some terrible mistake he's made recently. No, his resignation is a purely political decision born from the fact that his poll numbers have hit rock bottom and his path to winning a fourth term was looking increasingly impossible. Other politicians in Trudeau's Liberal Party had been turning aggressively against him in recent weeks, with a growing number of Liberal parliamentarians declaring that he should end his bid for a fourth term and step down for the good of the party. And by the first week of January 2025, it was clear that Trudeau's leadership of the Liberals had become too controversial to be sustainable, and thus he made his big declaration on the morning of January the 6th.
I intend to resign as party leader, as Prime Minister, after the party selects its next leader through a robust, nationwide, competitive process.
So, there are a few big conclusions that we can draw about some of the problems with the Canadian political system right off the bat. One is that there are no term limits. In theory, a Canadian Prime Minister can keep running for re-election forever, and this fact tends to seduce a lot of Canadian prime ministers with dreams of indefinite power. In the last 30 years, Canada has now seen 3 prime ministers win a third term, who then immediately begin making plans for a fourth. This would have made any of them Canada's longest continuously serving prime minister in over 100 years, which was obviously a pretty audacious goal, and yet they all chose to go for it. The Canadian public, however, doesn't want prime ministers that hang around for this long, and as a result, all of these guys saw their approval numbers tank midway through their third term, thereby making their fourth term dreams look increasingly far-fetched, if not pathetic. 2 of them wound up resigning before their fourth election, while the other one just ran for a fourth term anyway, and predictably got crushed by Justin Trudeau himself, incidentally. It's annoying that Canadians have to keep going through this same political soap opera over and over, because it always plays out the same way. The Prime Minister wins a third term and basks in his success, and there is initially some ambiguity as to whether or not he plans on running a fourth time. And then eventually they say yes, and no one really questions it at first because, it seems a long way off. But then as the Prime Minister's years in power begin to drag on, the public grows increasingly sick of them and their poll numbers begin to decline. And then their political party starts to get nervous about the next election, and pretty soon there is all this gossip in the press about how senior figures in the party are starting to question the Prime Minister's leadership, and Cabinet Minister so-and-so thinks that they should be Prime Minister instead, and all of this sort of thing. And then this segues into a campaign of low-key bullying the Prime Minister into resigning, which the press eagerly eggs on. Now, in fairness to the Prime Ministers, there is really no elegant solution to this. It is almost impossible to make a dignified exit in a regime with no term limits. If you announce that you have no intention of seeking another term, people will immediately start gossiping that, oh, he didn't feel confident that he could win again. He didn't want to face a humiliating defeat. What a coward. What a quitter. But on the other hand, if you brave the odds and just run for another term anyway, you will get blasted as an arrogant egomaniac whose vanity is steering his party to a humiliating defeat. What a loser. And thus we see the quitter-loser complex that always taints the final years of every Canadian prime ministership, and inevitably inflicts a long period of paralysis upon the Canadian government in which nothing productive gets done because the only thing anybody is talking about is the Prime Minister's future, which was basically the story of Canadian politics in 2024, where the only political debate anybody was having was about Trudeau's hold on power, as opposed to any substantial issue or policy. Now, as I alluded to, the way that unpopular Canadian prime ministers of this sort often wind up leaving office is by getting bullied into resigning. Politicians from the prime minister's party start complaining that they don't have faith in him anymore, first in private and then to the press. And then eventually this chorus of complaining gets so loud and distracting and embarrassing that the PM quits in a fit of shame. This end of regime tradition, incidentally, is basically the only time in Canada that members of a prime minister's party ever criticize him publicly. 99% of the time, Canadian politicians are obsessively loyal to their party leader, which is why the moment that any criticisms start to be expressed in public, it is generally treated as a very dramatic moment signaling that a point of no return has been passed. Another reason why this sort of bullying and shaming tends to be so popular is because in the Canadian system, there is not really any well-established alternative process for allowing a Canadian political party to ditch its boss, especially when that boss is currently serving as Prime Minister of the country. Generally speaking, once you are appointed head of a Canadian political party, you are locked in pretty tight. So, just to refresh, in the Canadian parliamentary system, the head of the political party that wins the most seats in the parliament becomes the prime minister. And this is all very officialized, with a party's candidate for prime minister occupying a formal position in their party's hierarchy, known simply as the leader. Party leaders are elected by the approximately 2% of Canadians who are formal, registered, card-carrying, and usually fee-paying members of political parties. Justin Trudeau was elected leader of the Liberal Party back in 2013 in an election decided by about 120,000 registered Liberal Party supporters. And that one vote Trudeau won 12 years ago has been the only internal Liberal Party election he ever had to win. That one vote gave him the mandate to lead his party through 3 separate elections as party boss, including 2 of them as incumbent prime minister seeking another term. Trudeau has never been forced to go through any sort of re-nomination contest because the Liberal Party is a private entity that makes its own rules, and the Liberal Party constitution does not require their party leader to ever face another vote. The Liberal Party constitution also contains no formal mechanism to kick out a leader that they have gotten sick of, which is why his politicians had to resort to shaming him into quitting on his own. The Conservative and NDP parties work in slightly different ways. Indeed, Jagmeet Singh and Pierre Poilievre only are where they are today because their parties chose to vote out a previous leader. But those systems have their problems too, in part because they only give their party members an up or down, the leader is good, or the leader should be fired choice, as opposed to a regularly scheduled election where the leader has to campaign to keep his job and campaign against would-be rivals. This simple yes or no system is a classic example of the old axiom that you can't beat someone with no one, which is probably why most of the time in Canada, incumbent party leaders get a 90% yes vote, even if they have already repeatedly lost multiple elections. It seems to me that a better democratic system would be one that forces the leaders of all of the political parties to face regularly scheduled competitive elections so that their position as party leader was constantly being refreshed with a true democratic mandate. I also think that the number of people who vote in these things should be dramatically increased beyond just the 2% of the Canadian population who are registered party members. Which leads me into the other problem that Trudeau's resignation has highlighted, the spectacle of new midterm prime ministers coming to power when the vast majority of Canadians have never voted for them. The Prime Minister of Canada is an extremely powerful office with a ton of unilateral power. They appoint all sorts of people to important government positions. They can issue all sorts of substantial government policies by independent decree. They can send our troops to war. They can schedule the exact timing of elections. For Canada to be a functional democracy, It is therefore